Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Roskies. It was my privilege to be working on the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization since day one. And the products of my labor, together with Sam Casso, is this amazing volume, Volume 9, Catastrophe and Rebirth, 1939 to 1973. And I was even able to publish this, a spin-off volume just about voices from the Warsaw Ghetto as a kind of companion volume to the larger one, designed to be used by in classrooms and in study groups. So let me begin by saying, and I want to go on record, to say that not since the Talmud Bavli, not since the Babylonian Talmud actually, has there been an anthological project like this one. And I'll tell you why. Because in its day, the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, was the whole of Jewish civilization, past, present, and future, in 63 tractates. And it wasn't an encyclopedia. It wasn't an encyclopedia where everything is synthesized and summarized and described and defined. But the Talmud is a kind of edited transcript of Jewish self-understanding in the making, almost in real time. What you hear is a marketplace of voices. It's Judaism live. And that's what the 10 volumes of the Posen Library are. It's Judaism live. It is no less eclectic and capacious than the Talmud. It draws on all areas of Jewish self-expression. It has a much larger cast of characters than does the Talmud. It gives voice for the first time ever to the other half of the Jewish people, Jewish women, girls, the whole experience of Jewish women, which, there is a volume of the Talmud about menstrual laws, but it's really a male conversation about the things that preoccupy men. And until the Steinsaltz Talmud, the Talmud was not really illustrated, whereas the Posen Library is extravagantly, really, you have no idea, no expense was spared, not only to find and to replicate, but to pay for these illustrations. You have no idea how costly that is. And you know what? Like the Talmud, the Posen Library conjures up for us a kind of paradise lost, a past, a very rich past, but it also projects a vital future for diaspora Jewry. So I want to pose the big question up front, not to the panelists, but for all of us to be thinking about as we hear the answers and begin our discussion, and that is English the new Aramaic? I think that's really the question. Is English the new Aramaic? Or to put it differently, how does a vernacular language, which is to say a language that Jews happen to be speaking at any time or place, become a Jewish language? What does it take for it to become a Jewish language? And the answer that this panel will suggest is its ability to translate and to mediate Jewishness, whatever that means. It becomes a Jewish language to the extent that it is able to mediate and translate Jewishness. If it becomes Targum, another name for Aramaic. So, my expertise is in Yiddish, so let me just share a few thoughts before we turn to the panel. One of the two names for Yiddish is Taich, and Taich means meaning or sense. So in Old Yiddish, there are phrases like, Das is azat Taich. This is how it's said in Yiddish. Or Das is in Taichen. This is what it means in Yiddish. But Verteichen means to translate, to explicate, to explain, because that is the central function of this language, to translate and to mediate. So on the one hand, Yiddish was called itself Loshen Ashkenaz. It was the language of everyday commerce. It's in all spheres of commercial life, legal life, intellectual activity, Ashkenazic Jews used Yiddish. But Yiddish was in its intellectual capacity and its written form was Taich. It was the language used to mediate what? The canonical texts written in Loshen Kodesh, in the sacred tongue, in Hebrew, Aramaic. So that's the big ticket item for this afternoon. Our session picks up exactly at the point where we left off just a few minutes ago. We're moving from anthologies to everyday speech, and where Aramaic is no longer the lingua franca of the majority of Jews in the world, but the Jewish world has split up into at least 3 distinct cultural geographic realms. Ashkenaz is one, which will be the purview of Yiddish. Loshen Sfarad, Sephardic Jews, will develop their own language, Ladino, and North African Jewry will develop Judeo-Arabic, which I'm going to call Lashon Maghreb. Can I call it? Is that okay?
I mean, well, they would call it Hakatiya in Morocco. There's all different. You could just say Arabic or Judeo-Arabic.
Judeo-Arabic is good enough?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So we have 3 new Jewish vernaculars that develop independently of each other in 3 different cultural spheres. Secondly, all 3 of these Jewish vernaculars are suddenly exposed to modernity, haskalah, to the Enlightenment, and they have to turn on a dime. They have to absorb a new world. How does that happen? And finally, or perhaps alongside that, all of these 3 languages undergo a sudden migration from the heartland to new homesteads. So there's a lot of common ground and a lot of comparison, and I, for one, have never been part of a conversation like this. So I am very excited to see how we will share these experiences. It's a comparative story that has yet to be told. So we are very fortunate this afternoon, courtesy of, I would say, the Frankel Center at the University of Michigan, to have 3 outstanding speakers on one forum. We will hear from one of them virtually on the screen. Devi Mays will be joining us, I guess, from Michigan. So she'll be part of this conversation. And all 3 of our panelists this afternoon are active translators and mediators in their own right. So you have the biographies in your booklets, Devi Mays, Brian Roby, and Anita Norwich. And we're going to begin by allowing each one of them to introduce themselves. In way of self-introduction, I'd like to ask you, what do you translate? And why do you translate what you translate? So, Debbie?
Hello, and It's odd. I can see Brian and Anita and David. I could see you all on the stage, but I don't know if you can see me. And thank you for making the accommodations for me to be able to participate in this conversation virtually. I have a sick baby, so I was not able to. We were not able to travel. So I am by training a historian. My PhD is from Indiana University in modern Jewish history, and in some ways, I feel a little bit out of place on this panel because Anita is somebody who has been my mentor at the University of Michigan, but also someone who I have learned so much about translation from, someone who actually is an expert in translation. And as I said, I'm a historian by training, and I work on the Ladino-speaking world, and particularly the late Ottoman Empire and the nation states that arose out of it, and how Ladino-speaking Jews accommodated the shift, the change from empire to nationalizing states. And when I was in graduate school, I, was reading all about Sephardic history, Sephardic culture, and when I say Sephardic here, I mean specifically Ladino-speaking Jews. And in terms of what was written about Ladino, um, there was my advisor worked on his first book was on Musar literature, so on ethical literature in Ladino. There have been people who work on translations of um, the Hebrew Bible into the Ladino text starting in the 16th century. And then there was a lot of focus, or an increasing focus, on works that were from European languages translated into Ladino, secular works like Gulliver's Travels, or things like Das Kapital by Marx, or The Jewish State, by Herzl. So different European thinkers and writers of various sorts, and not that much focus on or even acknowledgement of the existence of Ladino literature, fiction, novels, novellas written in the late 19th, early 20th century by Ladino-speaking Jews about what they were experiencing. And there was sort of a sense that such literature either didn't exist, or if it existed at all, it wasn't really important. And when I was doing my dissertation research, I came across about migration. I came across a novella that was published in 1919 or 1920 called La Novia Aguna, the Aguna bride, or Aguna fiance, that was all about how international migration disrupted Jewish family structures, how the changes of the 20th century transformed gender roles, generational expectations, prestige occupations. And that made me interested in discovering what other Ladino novels there were that spoke to what Sephardi Jews were experiencing in this period of great change, and then translating those to make them available for teaching tools, but also for my colleagues in Jewish literatures to know that there was a vibrant Ladino literary scene that just hasn't been fully acknowledged or appreciated. I think in part because there are so few scholars of Ladino who can read these texts in the original language. And I think Brian and I have had conversations about this. I think it's a similar thing to what we see happening in the Maghreb as well, that there's then a sort of scholarly dismissal of even the existence of these literatures. So I see myself as, why I love translating these materials, in part because I love reading them. And I love what they can teach us about who and what Sephardi Jews were in this period, and then make our collective knowledge of Jewish cultures, of Jewish literature, and of Jewish experiences that much richer.
Wonderful. Thank you. Brian.
Yeah, so I translate quite a few things, Hebrew, French, and Judeo-Arabic, mostly from the Maghreb in North Africa. A lot of the literary works that I look at are from Tunisia and somewhat from Morocco. Um, why I do it? I work on North African Jewish history and their migration to Europe and to Israel, Palestine, and what I find is that somewhat what's missing a lot of times is kind of the cultural aspects, like the kind of lived experiences of what people were going through before they got to the place, and what was in their minds while they're there in this new kind of wherever place they move to. And today I think I'm going to talk about probably just focus on one work, maybe two. One in particular that's in the Posen Library collection and one of the volumes, which is by Benish Hai, which is not Moroccan, not North African. It's an Iraqi text written in Judeo-Arabic. It's really fascinating in a sense. It's a text that looks at that answers this question about how do women behave, which may be strange as like kind of a feminist primer, but it's written by a person who's at the time was called the kind of head of the galut, the head of exile, the Resh Galuta, Benish Hai. And reality, he's actually responding, it's part of a correspondence that he had with a very wealthy woman, Rivka Belilos, who was living in Singapore and Hong Kong. She's originally from India, but of Baghdadi origin. And so she writes these letters to Rabbi Yosef Haim and asks, well, the way that women behave in this place is quite different from what I hear people behave, how women behave in Baghdad. Is what I'm doing okay? Is how do I engage with my Jewishness and my femininity within a new context as I'm moving back and forth between these geographical and societal changes? And it's not just that he dictates to her, okay, dress like this, walk like this, act like this. He asks her, oh, well, how do you think about how women dress? If you see a woman in a skirt, how do you feel about that? If you see a woman in pantsuit or something like that, how do you feel about that? And so it's really a conversation. And so what I find difficult actually is translating that into kind of English in a sense, kind of translating that entire experience of migration, of kind of like cultural migration back and forth between various different contexts. So yeah, that's to answer the question of why I translate. One is for professional reasons. For a while, I didn't really think of myself as a translator. It was just kind of like, yeah, I mean, I know these languages and I use them for writing the history of these peoples. But then as I thought about it more, it's really kind of to feed my soul and to kind of maybe feed the soul of others as well, as Davey was pointing out. All the more so in Judeo-Arabic, there's a lot less scholarship in that in that language. Mostly because a lot of people in Jewish studies don't necessarily know the language. It's considered a dying or dead language in some aspects, and most of the scholarship prior to, let's say, the 21st century was mostly focused on the medieval period. So kind of freezing in time this aspect of Jewish engagement with Arabic, with the Arab world, and kind of forgetting that Jews did, and actually some do still live in the Arab world to this day. So what does it mean to actually not revive a language or, kind of looking at something as dead, but actually kind of looking at that society that has been erased? How do we tell those stories of something that's been erased that is still alive and not dead? Yeah, please.
I would agree with everything, except I work in Yiddish literature, which is not anymore as underrepresented as it once was, I'm happy to say. But I translate for the same reasons that Brian does, which is to say that I love it. I can sit for a good half hour trying to figure out whether this character would have said scared or frightened, shaking or quivering. That, that feels like both a creative act and a necessary act. I have been translating prose works by women from Yiddish because I had a very specific, and I like to think in retrospect at least, strategic reason for doing this. When I started in this field, I asked a senior scholar in Israel, who I will not name, but some of you will guess. I asked for a list. My degree is in the history of the English novel. And I asked for a list of prose works that I had to read in order to do a minor field on my oral exams in Yiddish. And he sent me very generously a list of about 100 authors, which I had to read in the next year and a half, which didn't quite happen. I didn't realize at the time, I didn't take note at the time that there wasn't a woman on that list. But, you know, consciousness grows. And it finally made no sense to me at all that I knew all of these novels in other European languages, but I didn't, by women, and I didn't have any in Yiddish. So I had the advantage, the wonderful blessing, really, of having a year here at the center on an NEH, where, because I had just recently retired from Michigan, although I still think of myself as part of Michigan, but because I had recently moved back to New York, I could afford the time, which I couldn't have done if I were still, you know, trying to get promoted, or of spending weeks, months in the library and archives here looking for names of girls who had written Yiddish. And it turns out, you won't be surprised, there are lots of them. There are lots of them. And I've been translating a number of them. I've also translated 20 untranslated stories by Israel Joshua Singer, who was both the subject of my very first book and now of more of his stories that never appeared. The book, that book is the one that I did that, you know, some people do, you know, people who can do, people who can't teach. Remember that one? People who can translate, people who can't write books about translation. And having written a book about translation, I thought maybe I should, you know, put my whatever, where my writing was. The book that I think is out, that I know is outside, I don't know if they're all outside, but at least one, is, this was the one that makes, you know, all these years of work absolutely worthwhile. It's a collection of short stories by a woman named Hannah Blankstein, whom nobody's ever heard of, including David, until it came out. And that was, for me, really a find. You know, one of those eureka moments where you think, this is a modernist text, a series of modern stories that take place in Eastern Europe, in France, in Germany. This is a traveler, this is a politically active woman, this is a feminist. Where has she been my whole life? And it turns out she's now in English. But that kind of, it's not just discovery, it's really changing the way in which we think of whatever we think of as a Yiddish literary canon, which I'm never sure how to define or identify. Not just adding to it, but changing the way that we think about the Ashkenazic, at least, confrontation with modernity. Modernity is not just a rebellion against religion. It's not just leaving your father's influence. There's a different sense of this if you include, again, this has been the theme, I think this is really the theme of the day, if you include voices that aren't heard or that have not been included for various reasons, and none of them good reasons.
So I want to pick up on that very theme. What we're hearing is that the translating from these vernacular languages that are endangered species is a way of an act of restoration, of recovery. But the kind of recovery that we seem to be focusing on is a product of modernity. The contact with modernity opened up new voices and new genres, new forms of Jewish self-expression that didn't exist before. So I'd like you to share with us, we began, maybe you discussed the discovery of fiction. Hey, you know, there was fiction in Ladino, and this is an area that is completely unknown. So talk to us about the challenge of discovery and translating that sense of discovery to us as readers. these new genres, what are they, and what kind of specific challenges does each genre present? So, translating a novel compared to, I don't know, some other maybe more traditional form of Ladino literature like ballads. Brian, I didn't actually catch what was the genre that that you were actually describing.
Yeah, so the one in particular is it's not quite a halachic work, but it's kind of along those lines by Ben Ishai. But there's also, I mean, I do a number of different genres. Some of them are kind of short stories, and then some of them are religious works that are actually kind of for the everyday life, if that makes sense. Everyday guides, you could say.
So you say it's a halachic, it was embedded in a halachic work?
Yes, yeah, yeah.
Ah, so how do you translate that? How do you convey to the reader that this is a Jewish legalistic text?
Yeah. Yeah. That's so. Okay. I'll start back from the beginning of this one. So this is Kanon Nisa, which in Arabic kind of translates to laws of women. This is the one by Ben Ishai, but it's difficult to translate into English, um, and also in Hebrew. So this is a curious thing that happens because it's not quite a legal text. It's more kind of a guidebook for the modern Jewish woman, if that makes sense. In Hebrew, it was translated as hukot, which is fairly problematic because the context or the connotation of a huk is that a law that you don't have to explain. It's like that, and don't ask questions. So, this is just what it is. But really, what he's doing in this case is really kind of having a conversation. He actually starts off the text with saying that I'm writing it in kind of vulgar or street Arabic, so that the woman who may not be able to read can have this read to her, and then she can read this and have a conversation with other women about how this is meant to be done. So yeah, that's one genre. The other genres that I do would be short stories, more because I personally don't like novels that much. I don't know, I just can't follow them for that long. And then poems as well. I do those, and those have very different kinds of things. This particular work is a mixture of all three. Everything rhymes within it, which is very difficult to convey in English and almost impossible. It's a 200-page kind of work, and every single line rhymes with the other one. And I don't know why. I know why he did it. It sounds very nice, but you can't really reproduce that in English. Yeah, that's kind of.
Devi, would you like to share with us some thoughts?
So I have a really I've also I translated for a previous Posen book some rules about drinking coffee on Shabbats. So I've also translated a little bit of the more sort of halachic takes. I was asked to translate a poem for Posen, and I completely failed at it. So that did not make it into anything because I find it very hard to capture the particular sort of cadence and rhyme structures of poetry in translation. There are people who do that from Ladino to English who are much more adept at it than I am. So what I have translated the most and what I enjoy translating the most, in part, I think, as Anita and Brian both expressed, because I enjoy reading it the most, is novels and novellas. And there are, I think, one of the greatest challenges that I have, again, as both Brian and Anita have touched on, I think there are common sort of themes coming out in all of our points, is that it's hard to transport a potential reader to a time and a place that are very different, right? And one of the challenges, that I often try to convey, is how to explain a place to a person, to the readers, that the naming of a specific street in Istanbul in a novel is laden with meanings about class, about religious belonging, or about religiosity, about the attachment of one to tradition or not, about the languages that one might have been exposed to on that particular street. How can I convey that in a translation, and it ends up being that I either feel like I have to write an introduction explaining that or footnote everything, or if I'm teaching from these texts, then I can just explain that to my students. But I've still yet to come up with a way of making the richness of these texts on a street level, or the richness of these texts even on the level of language, where Sephardi Jews at the time period that these novels were being written, in the late 19th and early 20th century, would have spoken Ladino, but also French, also have some familiarity with Turkish, with Greek, with Italian, um, with Arabic, with Slavic languages, depending on where they were located. And they use multiple languages to add meaning and depth to the text that also I find very challenging to translate. So I guess it's not really answers there as opposed to the
perfect.
questions that I have still
That's
and the
perfect.
challenges.
Yeah.
To pick up from that, one of the main challenges for me as a Yiddish translator has to do with the multilingual background of every single Yiddish writer and reader, right? So I can sort of fake it in 4 languages, but I can't fake it in 12. And these writers are using not just words wholesale that come from these other languages, often Slavic languages, but phrases and references and all of that that really I struggle with very hard. And part of that struggle is to convey in the English the fact of that multilingualism, right? And I found various ways of doing that. Some of them, sort of cheaper than others. Italicize the word, spell an English word that makes its way into a Yiddish text. When you translate it back into English, spell it as a Yiddish reader would have heard it, right? So chair is Tcheer. You're not going to get it right away, but by the next sentence, I'll say, that's the chair he chose, right? So that you can go back and sort of get that. So I think this interlinguistic nature is the most challenging, and on some level, the most fun. The most difficult one of these was in a couple of I.J. Singer's stories, where he is in the middle of the Russian civil wars. So where is Vilna? Right? Yiddish readers at the time would have known the history of the city or of the battles. I don't expect my readers to know that. I certainly don't expect my students to know that. So there, you actually have to say, I don't like footnotes in my translations. I like introductions and conclusions, where much of this can be explained. But every once in a while, you sort of have to give in to the foreignness of it. I know you're asking about Talmud and Jewishly laden. That's on some level almost less of a problem, because particularly like Bible, there are lots of wonderful translations of the Bible that are available. I don't have to work that hard. If it's a Talmudic something, I might give a literal translation and then explain where it comes from, as though it were in the text. Remember that translations are for a new audience, and you have to know both what that audience is likely to know and how to tell the audience what it needs to hear, what it needs to understand.
What do you do about dialogue? You have dialogue embedded within a halachic discourse. So, and you said that it had to be in the spoken Arabic so that women. So what do you do with that?
Yeah, I was going to add something, and maybe this will
Okay.
kind of answer that as well. Is that something that kind of is paradoxical about kind of the challenges of modernity is that of Jewish multilingualism. This is something almost across the board that prior to kind of this engagement with modernity, most Jewish communities spoke a plethora of languages. How do you translate that into English in a monolingual context? It's almost impossible, not quite impossible, but it serves as a really big challenge in terms of expressing, what does it mean when you're reading something in Judeo-Arabic and you're kind of expecting it to be Arabic, and then all of a sudden you kind of see a kind of weirdly misspelled French word, and it takes you like maybe minutes or an hour to realize, oh, this is French. Oh, this is English, but it's written in the way that they would say it, right? That's something that comes across in the same ways that, in this kind of the dialogue in between that happens as well, both in terms of trying to translate it to, let's say, an American audience. So remembering that the context is, at least for Benish Hai, it's under, kind of an Islamic or even Asian context that he's trying to translate this. So their frames of reference isn't kind of Western Christendom, it's Islam, right? And so having him translate to kind of like colloquial people, okay, this about, what God is, or how people in general engage with God, or, the divine or something like that. But then how do you translate that, him talking to him as an Iraqi rabbi, talking to someone in Hong Kong, and then me, an American, translating this kind of thing, him talking to someone in Hong Kong who's from India, and then also writing to people in Singapore and places like this. It's a lot of different challenges.
David, do you want to weigh in about multilingualism?
Yeah, I think going also back to the point of Hebrew, that the Sephardic pronunciation of Hebrew is different than the Yiddish pronunciation of Hebrew, and is also different than the modern Israeli pronunciation of Hebrew. And as Brian was noting, with Judeo-Arabic and Ladino, you also see the writing of French words in Hebrew script, and the Rashi script is usually how it's printed. But also you see the use of, incorporation of Hebrew, but when they oftentimes in novels, particularly when they're quoting Hebrew, when they're incorporating it into dialogue, or if it is, them talking about a specific Jewish holiday or throwing a phrase in Hebrew, they translate, they write the Hebrew in the Rashi script, so that it's not distinguished through script that it's Hebrew, but they also write it as it would have been pronounced by Sephardi Jews at the time, not how it would be pronounced to a modern Israeli audience today, or to, a modern Hebrew-speaking audience. And so one of the challenges, one of the the challenges that I've come across in reading Ladino with graduate students who are familiar with Hebrew is that sometimes, the Israeli graduate students I've had have a harder time reading the Ladino when there's Hebrew in it, because it's completely nonsensical to them. But when I translate it into English, I make sure to transliterate the Hebrew as it would have been spoken as it was written in the Ladino, not to modernize the way that Hebrew is written. I think another thing that's hard to capture with the multilinguality is that it can convey all sorts of different that meanings can be conveyed through the use of language specifically, but also through the type of that language that's used. So the way that Turkish is incorporated into Ladino can be a way of indicating that, you're having a conversation, a Jewish character is having a conversation with someone who's not Jewish, and so they're using Turkish, but writing it in Hebrew characters. Or it can be two Jewish characters, one of whom's really low class and using all of these Turkish swear words that are written in Ladino. And so how do you convey that? And I think, I've learned a lot from reading Anita's work in terms of italicizing or using font difference to try to indicate that. But it, it really is a challenge. And as Brian noted, I think particularly that we are largely now translating for a monolingual audience, particularly if we're using these as teaching tools, that most of our students are not, if they are multilingual, it's likely to be one other language, not 12.
I would add maybe maybe one thing. The expectations, the aesthetics of translation have changed dramatically over time. Right? If you read Yiddish translations from the 30s, the 60s, 1930s, 60s, 70s even, you will read about prayer shawls and phylacteries, which for a while I thought was a dirty word I didn't understand. It sounded wrong. You know, what's a... Now, if it's in an English dictionary, it's talus and tefillin. And it's not just in order to use those words, but it's also in order to convey to a reader a sense of a lack of seamlessness, right? If you think this is written in English, you need to know that you're reading about a different culture. Yes, you can understand it, but you have to recognize that it's not the Upper West Side in 2020, right? You have to recognize that it's coming from somewhere else. And I think that's a really serious challenge, particularly for an American audience who often thinks that equality means similarity, right? If they're like me, I understand. If they're not, it's not my problem. I want it to be the reader's problem to have to understand that. I don't mean I want to make it difficult, but you know, you don't know what tefillin is. You may not know the history of Vilna. It's possible to find out without too much effort. And what I need for you to understand, I will explain within the text. Right? Vilna, which I don't know why I'm stuck on Vilna, probably because I'm looking. I don't know anything about Vilna, in fact, you know, except Langstein was from Vilna. You know, it was Russian, it was Austro-Hungarian, it was Lithuanian, it was Polish, it was not Polish, maybe it was Polish on Tuesday, but not next Wednesday. I can explain that actually within a text. That the armies that are coming back and forth are, you know, wearing these uniforms because they are of that nation. The Yiddish original doesn't say they're of that nation. It just says blue. So I have to figure out what's a blue uniform. But that I think is the responsibility of the translator, both to make it accessible and to foreignize it just enough so that you know this is another culture. And I think it's important for us to know this is another culture.
So Debbie, you mentioned students. So put on your teacher caps now for a minute, because the three of you teach and work and work with living students. How do you use, or how should, or how can the texts that you translate be used in a classroom where, ready for this, neither the students nor the teacher knows the source language? That's the question.
You want to go? Okay. I don't think of myself, or I'm not speaking for them, I'm speaking for how I think of them, as gatekeepers. You know, it's not my job to keep everybody out of understanding Yiddish. It's exactly the opposite, right? That is, I know that these texts are going to be used by people who don't know a word of Yiddish. I hope they're used by people who don't know a word of Yiddish, because it means that they're getting to people who don't know what Jewish characters are, what Jewish life is, what anything is that has to do with the world of, in my case, Ashkenaz, right? So I think when I teach, I spend a lot of time on context, right? Where is this coming from? When is it coming from? What else is going on around? And if I'm translating for an academic audience or writing for an academic audience, I trust professors at universities, at least, to read the context, to read the introduction and the conclusion. They're not going to have the full range of knowledge that I hope all of us have, but they'll have enough to be able to convey something about this other culture and this other language. And this is the secret, you know, the dirty little secret that I have, which is that when I teach texts in translation, I'm hoping it will make students want to learn Yiddish. It happens not all the time, but it happens enough to keep my illusion working.
Debbie, would you like to weigh in?
Sure. I mean, I think I don't expect anyone who reads the text that I translate to know Ladino or to, whether that's the instructor or the students. And I have had one undergraduate student, graduate students are different, at University of Michigan, who took a class with me and then wanted to learn Ladino afterwards and actually did. And so, Anita's dream there, it does happen occasionally. But I think what we as instructors want to inspire in our students in part is a sense of curiosity and wanting to know more, and that inspire that curiosity. And I think many of us as faculty, as professors, we also hope to like we should have that curiosity. And so I don't know everything. There's far more that I don't know than I do know. And I teach on stuff that I'm not an expert in all the time. And I read to learn how to bring that context to my students, how to figure out what are the questions that are worth asking, and also give place for those students to ask questions that I didn't anticipate. And then if I don't have the answer for it, I say, I'm not sure, I'll go look it up, and next class, we can talk about it. And so I hope that with the translations, if somebody, is teaching a text that I've translated from Ladino, that, if they don't have all the answers, they can look up some information. There's plenty out there now that can help them do that. And, we're also resources. I've fielded questions from colleagues, who teach modern Middle East history, who want something on Ladino that they can incorporate into their classes. And I send them something that I've translated that I just have on my computer, and we'll talk them over how to teach this. I think these texts they can be fun. They can provoke so many questions, whether you come in with knowledge or don't, and whether you're the instructor or the student. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Ryan, would you like to add something?
Yeah, just a little bit. I think a lot of it has to do with being the job of the translator, and in both Davey and I's, my case, in that the languages that we work on and work with are languages that many people don't know. I have had one student who was interested in kind of like Judeo-Arabic. He was not a Judeo-Arabic speaker. Yeah, most of the people that I know who speak Judeo-Arabic are much older than I am, and not students at Michigan. And so with the student, he knew Arabic. He was a Muslim student, undergraduate. And he was just curious about how Jews engaged with the language, both in terms of religious texts, but also in cultural texts. And so that gets to the job of the translator, that we really do have to provide a lot of context for these languages that are not spoken as much. Providing that historical context, but also cultural, and and also kind of in terms of gender relations, particularly with this Benish High text, with thinking through how these texts, although they are over 100 years old, or 100 years old, or 80 years old, or something like that, that they do speak to questions of today. So Benish High text, which is half halacha, half poetry, half this and that, it really gets at this question of gender relations and gender constructs, and how they do shift and change over time and place. And so that's one way to kind of engage both the reader and people who don't know the language, is that the translator must actually bring that out there to say that, okay, this is how people who are reading in English may engage with this. This is a spark that may kind of shine.
So I want to ask you one last question before we open up for, we have a few minutes to open up for questions in the audience. I was very moved by your opening statements, because each of you spoke from the heart, and your personal passion for the languages that you're translating. So my question is, the Posen Library is a library of Jewish culture and civilization. So in the act of translating from Yiddish, in the act of translating from Ladino, in the act of translating from Judeo-Arabic, you're conjuring up for yourself, in your own mind, that lost civilization. So, we Yiddishists made up a word. We call it Yiddish land, which never existed. It's, it's a figment of our imagination, but it's a construct that we build in our minds as we familiarize ourselves with this culture. So I'm going to ask you to think about that construct. When you're translating, what is the Yiddish land that you're conjuring up for us as readers? What is the Sephardia that you want us to take away when we read your translations? What is the Judeo-Arabia that you inhabit in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to think over that question. I think we're kind of pressed on time a little bit. So I'm wondering, do we have time for questions at all? I mean, I would love to answer this question. But just kind of concerned. Okay, so 5 minutes. All right. Yeah. And here, do you want to? Okay. Yeah. So the land that I want to conjure up is, I guess, as Benny Shai put it, the Arabistan and Hindustan, which were, this was the most intriguing thing to me about this text, because I was like, what is this place? I've never heard of this Arabistan and Hindustan. And actually, they were places based on language and culture, really. They were Jewish geographies that are not necessarily, that maybe never existed or don't exist in a sense, but exist within the kind of social milieu of people. That their relationship to, and one aspect that I failed to mention is that they also are English speakers, in Hong Kong and Southeast Asia. And so then making that connection of that, the Arab world, the Jewish Arab world in that sense, was not just in Iraq and kind of died out with the migration of Jews from Iraq, but also is, a part of the Anglophone world, right? Something that people can engage with in that sense, and then kind of thinking through, if English now is the lingua franca of of Jewish people, then we can also think about it as that, as part of our own heritage as well in some ways.
Devi?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and I, like Brian, need more time, I think, to think about it. But, I think one of the things that I hope people capture of the Sephardic world that these works came out of, that I've translated, is that it was a world of profound possibilities in some ways, that the futures that the writers were imagining and that the people who were reading these texts were imagining for themselves didn't really look at like the futures that ended up to come to pass, but that doesn't mean that they're less valuable for the fact that they didn't come to pass. And that, there was humor and there was passion and there was anger and there was, intergenerational conflict. That's something that comes up a lot, of what parents expected from their children and what their children, male and female, expected from their parents and expected from themselves and wanted for themselves. And I think in that way, these stories, even though they're from 100 years ago, 120, 50 years ago, they're still very real. And, they're stories that can speak to challenges of our day, both thematically, but also in terms of what the granularity of these challenges were, of family relations, of changing economies, of the world, of a sense that the world is changing under your feet, and how do you make sense of that?
Great.
I'll be quick. I don't think that I can conjure Yiddish land. I don't know what it is. It was whatever it was so diverse that it would be presumptuous to, claim it in some way. What I do claim by translating these works, by translating Yiddish, is the life that was lived by the people who spoke it, right? This is not how Yiddish is always described, right? Yiddish died, it was murdered, and now there's a revival, but it doesn't really count for much, or maybe it counts for a little. I'm invoking a world that was, as David said, varied, alive, interesting, vibrant, and and I remember I'm a literary translator, right? So I'm not responsible to the historians. She says quietly.
So what do we have time for? 5 minutes? Wait. We privileged the front last time. Is there someone in the back that wanted to ask a question? I can't really see, so someone will have to help me out here.
I heard from a professor some time ago in this room who stated that Judeo-Arabic is simply, in his learned opinion, Arabic with Hebrew characters. In your learned opinion, whether you agree or disagree, other than the occasional, borrowed word from a third language, if you consider Judeo-Arabic to be a distinct language, in a manner that a native Arab speaker, a Muslim Arab speaker from the same stratum and the same time would be able to read the document in Judeo-Arabic if it was simply transliterated into Arabic, and how does that affect your evaluation?
Yeah, I was smiling because I'm very familiar with this argument. I don't necessarily engage with the question of whether or not it's a distinct language. I call it Judeo-Arabic in English because it's kind of easy to grasp onto the meaning of it. It really depends on the country's context. So in my context, let's say in Tunisia, sometimes it was called Babariya, which is Berber Arabic, which doesn't make sense. And then in Morocco, it's called Hakatiya, which is just kind of speaking in a way. Is it distinct? One, in a sense, the Jewish accent it tends to be, or tended to be, and tends to be distinct within Arabic. The way people talk, there's an syllabated S oftentimes, particularly in the Moroccan context. There's ways of kind of like speaking that are very different or slightly different from Muslims. But most importantly, in the written form, what's most distinct is that these are the first cases in which you have lehja, darja, or colloquial vulgar Arabic written down on paper. There is within Arabic, it's called fusha, pure Arabic, and that is the only thing that really should be written down. What people speak on the street, that's just kind of dirty. That's not something that's meant for writing. That's not meant for novels and things like that. In the case of Jews, it's something that they spoke, how they read, and it's one of the first instances in which you have that written down and documented and preserved in a sense, right? So that's the important distinction between Judeo-Arabic and Arabic.
One more question, what do you think? Or what? Yes, sir.
Hello. Okay. So you all addressed to some degree the question of foreignization versus domestication of the text when you're translating. And I've often heard literary translators say that they foreignize more if they're writing for academics, and they domesticate more if it's for the public's reading pleasure. For those of you who translate fiction, how do you navigate that and decide where on that spectrum you want to pitch your translation?
I want to pitch it toward readability. I don't care whether, I mean, just speaking, I don't care whether it's an academic or, Amcha or, somebody off the street who's reading it. It needs to be understood in English for as varied an audience as I can muster. And the academic will do more research, maybe read, my introduction and conclusion, maybe the reader on the street will do the same. But if not, remember, it's an act of interpretation. Translation is always an act of interpretation. You're going to be reading my interpretation. Maybe it's not the right one. Maybe it's not the best one. But it's the one that I have to make understandable, clear for the common reader.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.